Some people are born princesses, whereas Joe had the uncanny privilege of having princesshood thrust upon him. It wasn't his idea, nor one he would have gotten from his parents either. Having a princess for a son was a plump, red raspberry in the face of many a long-standing tradition, and an invitation to all manner of change for which the king and his queen were in no way prepared. You see, before Joe was born, King John and Queen Jane did not embrace change as though it were a trusted friend and ally. They might have shaken hands with it at a formal gathering, or scrounged up a few tears at his funeral had it died unexpectedly. But if the winds of change had gone into exile with their master, and chosen never again to visit their fair kingdom of Mundania, the king and queen would have sounded no alarms, and grieved in only their second or third best mourning cloaks. Indeed, fair was an apt description of Mundania and her people, as opposed to good, bad, or exceptional in any way. For in Mundania, eggs were eaten scrambled, with no salt or pepper. Citizens wore the same hairstyle for 20 years at a time. Knights fought in jousts that began after their 12 o'clock lunches and ended before their 5 o'clock suppers, none of whom got hurt too badly, because not one man jack among the Mundanian knights was particularly brave or bashful. In short, Mundania was, well, mundane, and it had been for centuries, but no one got bored because they did not know what it was like to be interesting. Fortunately for Joe, his parents' yearning for a child was far greater than their fear of change. They had also tried in vain to conceive for a number of years. Therefore, when the queen's velveteen gowns at last grew too tight around the waist for the hope that she might be pregnant to be dismissed as wishful thinking, the king and she danced like mad and wept happy tears on each other's shoulders. At that time, on some level, they knew that having a baby was going to change everything. What they did not yet know on any level is just what everything meant. Something like 9 months later, the royal household of Mundania became the royal family of Mundania. King John watched in pride and terror as portly midwives guided Queen Jane through the sweat, tears, and aptly named labor of bringing their baby into the world. At the end of the ordeal, after the final push was given, King John threw a tremulous arm around his wife and kissed her forehead. Queen Jane smiled breathlessly at her newborn as she cradled him in her arms for the first time. Moments later, criers cried and church bells pealed in proclamation of the child's birth, and the kingdom rejoiced, in moderation, of course, as is the Mundanian way. That following week, on the morning of the newborn's christening, gold and plum-colored banners fluttered in the breeze below the limestone parapets of King John's modest castle in the city of Bordeaux. Stewards procured the customary amount of wine. Bakers baked the customary number of cakes. Linen-clad cooks simmered sweetmeats in the castle kitchens, while solemn, efficient servants ushered visiting dignitaries to their rightful places so they did not get lost. From high-backed oaken chairs, guests with differing opinions on what was grandeur and what was not subtly appraised the home of the Mundanian king. Visitors from poorer countries tried not to be impressed by the high-vaulted ceilings atop marble columns and the floor-to-ceiling diamond-pane windows that shed light on the great hall from all sides. Visitors from wealthier countries tilted their heads in quiet puzzlement at walls adorned with what had to be the most horridly practical tapestries on earth. The weep was entirely gray, contained no pictures or inventive textures, and led one to assume that Mundanian weavers live in happy ignorance that tears on the cheeks of a bored onlooker could mean anything other than joy. The walls themselves were comprised of inexpensive bricks, but from time to time the pattern of these bricks was interrupted by a priceless relief of foreign craftsmanship that seemed a little too wonderful for the walls in which the masons had placed it. Visitors who attended gatherings of this kind for the drama and the spectacle that almost always ensued when dignitaries from diverse realms are stuck in a crowded room together had begun to twiddle their thumbs and nod off in their chairs. The omission of would-be trouble-starters was not an oversight. In making out her guest list, Queen Jane had been careful to invite only persons of average distinction. This standard of averageness applied both to mortals and to magical creatures, including giants who were not too tall, goblins who were not too frightening, and sirens whose songs were not overpoweringly pretty, none of whom felt obliged to quarrel or carouse with one another. They just weren't quite interesting enough to pick fights with. "I do wish Lady Ambrosia would hurry," Lady de Foie Gras whispered to her husband, the Marquis. "It isn't even noon yet, and I've dutifully prattled through my entire catalogue of small talk." "Fret not, my love. It's not your fault. There's only so much weather to talk about at this time of year," replied the Marquis, as if sleep-talking, with his hands folded and his eyes shut. The Marquis's young wife, bless her, was a bit new to gatherings of this kind, and therefore terribly concerned about saying the wrong things. The Marquis had no such concern, having learned long ago that if he pretended to be a sleeping foreigner who probably didn't know the language very well anyway, he was seldom required to say much. "Do you think she could have forgotten?" asked Lady de Foie Gras. "Titles like godmother and ambassador might slip her mind, but not guest of honor. She'll be here by and by, God save us," said the Marquis. As if in conspiracy with the fairies, the sun hid behind a cloud, and the hall grew dim at the precise moment Lady Ambrosia and her shimmering entourage began their procession through the midst of the assembly. The first to enter were the war fae, who wore great black beetles' wings on their backs. Their ruddy, calloused thumbs were as wide as King John's wrist, and each kept his own rhythm as he walked so as not to shake the foundation with the stomp, stomp, stomp any two of them would have made by marching in tandem. Behind them flew the smallest of the fairies, who were roughly the size of thimbles. They looked from a distance like the flickering balls of light mortal children might dream of catching under their teacups, had their parents been careless enough not to caution them against antagonizing the fae. Lady Ambrosia herself wore a dress made from the petals of a trumpet flower, the size of which must have been more like a tuba or a sousaphone than an actual trumpet. She was not at all the petite, fragile-looking creature one sometimes pictures when storytellers speak of fairies. Lady Ambrosia's build was plump and matronly. She was nearly as tall as Queen Jane, taller by little if she fluttered, as she often did, on lacy wings which threw color when the sunlight hit them, just as a prism would do. Her dress was bejeweled with 200 amber beads, and her hair was pinned in tight, deliberate curls. Knowing how terribly important normality was to the Mundanians, Lady Ambrosia had taken great pains to look the part of the average fairy godmother. For her effort, she had become the embodiment of average poise, average dignity, and the average amount of showing off. To the dismay of the king and queen, Lady Ambrosia also had an average case of attention deficit. She well knew that she had come to Mundania to publicly bless her godchild, but she had stopped listening to her advisers before they could remind her that this godchild was a boy. Therefore, when it was her turn to speak, she bestowed on the child the gifts that fairies usually reserve for princesses, and presented him to all the world as Princess Jo. Murmurs of shock resounded in the great hall. Queen Jane swooned. King John stood with his mouth agape, too stunned to speak at first. Lady de Foie Gras experienced an acute case of narcolepsy and fell asleep on her husband's shoulder, having rightly interpreted this to be a situation to which she could contribute neither small nor big talk. And a confused Lady Ambrosia looked this way and that, wondering what on earth the matter was. King John explained the matter. He begged Lady Ambrosia to take back her gifts, but even as he pleaded, he knew that her words were binding. You see, in those days, Mundanians took words more seriously than they took famine, war, or pestilence. Since the time of their tribal ancestors, before Mundania was even a country, their laws, their history, and anything worth remembering was spoken, not written. By and by, this led them to revere all spoken words, let alone the words of a fairy godmother, as if they were magic words. "Even an average fairy can't unsay what's said," said Lady Ambrosia, and with that she vanished in an orange cyclone of pixie dust and embarrassment. After their guests had excused themselves from an unearthly quiet post-christening feast, the king and his queen had a long talk with their even-tempered, pea-shaped abbot. His relationship to the fairies was by no means a warm one, but for 3 mortal generations he had overseen every occasion momentous enough to warrant their presence. This made him the closest thing Mundania had to an expert on the workings of fairy magic as it pertained to newborns. All told, Jo's natal celebration is nothing like the soberest I've ever known, said the abbot. You should have seen your great-aunt Jean's face in the year of the grape blight when she had to toast a baby's health with onion wine. What can we expect now that Jo's legally a princess? Asked the king. Is he healthy? Asked the abbot. Yes, said the king. Are we certain he's still a boy? Asked the abbot. The king looked to his wife, who had retreated to the far side of the room, and turned her back to them while she nursed the infant princess. She lifted the edge of Jo's linens with one finger and glanced beneath them for a nervous moment before vigorously nodding her head. As enchantments go, the plight of princesshood is not so bad, said the abbot. At some point he may talk to animals, or reflections due to the spell at work in his system, or he might be a little extra good at something girls his age would normally do. And I expect he'll ask some tough questions as he nears the customary age of marriage. But if we all live long enough to see that, we should count ourselves, pardon the expression, blessed. The abbot held up a lengthy string of beads between himself and Joe and said his own magic words over the child, though not out loud. He had attended enough prior christenings to know better. Then he bid the royal family a better day, and returned to his abbey. King John and Queen Jane did not despair. They didn't know how to despair. Mundanians never permit themselves to be sad for very long. They promptly decided they would love Princess Joe and raise him the best they could, come what may. As a baby, Joe was all giggles and dimples whenever his grown-ups showed him rattles and bright colors. He cried like all babies, but being a princess, his cries were lovelier than most lullabies. This tended to flummox his nursemaids, as he would often be the one to lull them to sleep, not vice versa. From infancy to toddlerhood, the fact that Joe was a princess would sometimes slip the minds of the Mundanian king and queen. Then the first real adventure in princesshood befell them, and it took the form of Joe's hair. Starting at 6 months old, the hair on Joe's head appeared neither in auburn ringlets like his mother's, nor fine tawny strands like his father's. Joe's hair grew in thick waves that fanned out like unruly rays of sunshine around the face of a cherub. It wasn't until he was 4 years old that his mother learned the trick of untangling the ends of Joe's hair first, then working her way to the scalp. Up to that point, it was 100% normal for the queen to snap 2 or 3 combs in half during each wrestling match with her son's voluminous locks. When the princess grew old enough to sit still for story time, a well-meaning nanny told Joe the tale of a peasant girl who had run away from a marriage-obsessed prince, only to have him catch her and carry her away to his castle in the end. She would have evaded him completely if she hadn't slipped out of her shoes when she took flight. In doing so, she left enough of a trail for that wily prince to find her at the home of her stepmother and 2 stepsisters. "That's horrific," thought Joe. 100 girls at your silly ball lining up to be your wife, and you pick the one that runs away? You deserve every bad thing that happens to you, sire. By this time in his life, Joe had figured out that some day he too might be expected to marry a prince if he did not take steps to avoid such a thing. Therefore, he resolved that he would never again take off his shoes, so that not even accidentally would he lose them, or find himself accosted by a similarly minded prince. This plan worked well enough for the first 5 days. He hadn't so much as run out of excuses for why he couldn't take a bath that morning, or why he needed to sleep under blankets too heavy for that time of year, and the shoes stayed on. Then his feet started to itch, and itch, and itch. He wiggled his toes and stomped his feet. He even pounded the soles of his boots with his fist, but nothing Joe did could stop the horrendous itching. Later that day, Queen Jane found herself sleepwalking in the middle of the afternoon. A sign she had come to assume meant that somewhere or other her son was crying. When she found the princess, he was on the steps outside the castle with one leg crossed over the other and clutching his uncomfortably shod foot. "What is the matter, my heart?" asked the queen. Princess Joe did not answer. "Joe?" asked the queen. He still did not answer. "Joseph Ulysses, shall I count to 3? Princess Joe sniffled. He wiped his nose and some miserable tears on his shirt sleeve before turning toward his mother with the bravest face he could muster. "My feet itch," said he, "and I can't scratch them, because if I scratch them, I'll have to take my shoes off, and if I take my shoes off, some big stupid prince will find them, and when he finds them, he'll find me, and he'll scoop me up and take me away." Joe buried his head in his hands as Queen Jane fell forward at the waist in the loudest, longest fit of laughter in Mundanian history. She then called for her husband and asked him to comfort their child while she went inside to recover. King John sat on the steps next to his son, and Joe explained the situation. The king nodded his head in earnest sympathy. After a long pause and some thoughtful tugs at his beard, he gave the boy a few things to consider. First of all, the girl in the story was not a princess already. If you had no more than a ramshackle cottage and a stepmother who did not like you as protection against the outside world, I would be worried about you myself. Second of all, you are 4 years old. You are not allowed to think about marriage for another 8 or 10 years at least. The king stopped and stole a glance at Joe's raggedy, mud-stained shoes. He suppressed the nigh unto acrobatic contortions his face was straining to make as he pictured the exhaustive stink, scrub, and purification ritual in the near future for whichever brave soul took up the task of washing his little boy's feet. "Third, and more importantly, son," the king continued, "if you never again take off your shoes, the big stupid prince won't need a trail to find you. He'll just head toward the stench of your dirty, nasty feet." "Hadn't thought of that," said Joe. King John threw Joe over his shoulder and carried him down to the stables. There Joe tore off his shoes and dragged his fingernails across the bottoms of his feet for a few glorious minutes of scratching. Each pass of his fingernails released a bit more odor into the atmosphere. Before he had finished, his father had to breathe through his mouth while Joe held his nose with one hand and scratched with the other. The king instructed his son to soak his lower limbs in the horse trough until soap and willing hands could be found with which to scrub his feet. When Joe's nanny learned of what had happened, she rolled up her sleeves and helped the boy wash, by way of apology for having frightened him by mistake. Shortly thereafter, the trough was drained and fresh water was drawn up to the benefit of the horses. Joe's shoes were buried, and the local cobbler fashioned a pair of new ones. He took no offense at the disposal of the previous pair, for the princess was, after all, a small boy with growing feet. The cobbler reckoned he was about due for a new pair anyway. In the time it took Joe to outgrow his next several pairs of shoes, he proved to be a cheerful, bubbling wellspring of traits that overjoyed and confused his parents to roughly equal degrees. He was hopeless on the king's fox hunts, because the fox and other woodland creatures were his friends. They would hide in his pockets until the hunters gave up, and Joe would send them on their way. In war games and fencing matches, he was as fierce as the next boy, but every attempt Joe made at a rebel yell or a war cry would come out sounding like a heartfelt ballad. The next boy, incidentally, was Gabriel Emir IV. Gabriel Emir IV was prince and firstborn to Gabriel Emir III, Sheik of the Glass Desert, and King John's dearest friend. Prince Emir may have been the least childlike child Joe had ever met in his life. While taller than his 5 brothers by as much as head and shoulders, young Emir towered over Joe, who stood only as tall as his waist at the time. Additionally, Emir's honey-colored eyes never glanced at anything. They fixated and scrutinized as though their owner, the prince, saw every object as a talisman and a holder of great secrets. Prince Emir and his brothers were not altogether sociable with Joe the first year they were all old enough to play together. Joe was a wee bit younger than the sheik's youngest son, and the thought of keeping company with a princess bored them silly. "This is a battlefield," they told him one afternoon amidst brandishing toy blades at each other. "No crying, no pretty things, and especially no princesses allowed. Go play dress-up or something." Joe thought that was a wonderful idea. He cut holes in one of his mother's old scarves to make a mask for himself, and tied another around his waist so he looked like a marauder. Then he filled a snood with rocks and swung it at Prince Emir and his brothers, demanding they surrender their weapons and whatever treasure they might be squabbling over. The fight ended quickly. All 6 of the Desert Sheik's sons laid down their cedar-hewn scimitars. Amal and Ahmed, the 2 middle boys, ran to their father and told him what happened through pouty lips and angry tears. The sheik suggested that for their own safety, it might be wise to share their games with the princess rather than provoke him to invent his own. "But what do we all know how to play?" asked Amal. "We can mine for rubies," said Joe. "Real ones?" asked Ahmed, raising a single skeptical eyebrow. "No, just pretend. But the rocks sparkle in the sun once in a while," said Joe. The princess showed the sons of the sheik how to dig for pretend rubies with spoons or trowels or whatever they could find. Prince Emir and the others found the mining of pretend rubies to be great fun compared with the mining of real rubies, which was not. Back home, grown-ups, like their uncle the minekeeper, would chase the boys away and make awful messes digging up their playgrounds if ever they found anything like real rubies, which they occasionally did. For the rest of their Mundanian holiday, Prince Emir, Prince Amal, Prince Ahmed, Prince Abram, Prince Ali, and Prince Abel enjoyed something of a cultural exchange with Princess Joe. The boys brought him back to their encampment and showed him the arts of sand painting and flint knapping. Of the 2, Joe found flint knapping to be the more brutal character-building exercise. Sand painters, he learned, were less apt than flint knappers to smash their thumbs in forming their masterpiece, or break it to bits just when they started to like the looks of it. Joe watched in awe the boys around him bash hunks of obsidian until they turned from hitherto formless rocks into practical blades. He then looked at his own first and second attempts at flint knapping, which lay at his feet in many shards of blue-green jasper that in no way resembled weapons. "I'm sorry about the waste, Excellencies," he said, a bit embarrassed at the mess he'd made of the semi-precious stones entrusted to him by his guests. "No need," said Abram. "Whatever's too small for knives we can turn into spear tips, and whatever's too small for spear tips we can turn into arrowheads," said Ali, and the brothers set to work smoothing sticks for the making of arrows. For Joe's part in the cultural exchange, he showed the princess some of the finer points of indoor living. He took them to the abbey atop the highest hill in Bordeaux, where they perused the many stained-glass windows, and made up their own stories if they didn't like the ones told by the pictures. Next, Joe stood them under the ceiling's center dome and challenged any one of the princes to speak quietly enough that his brothers could not hear him. Each of them whispered their softest, but the dome had been built to magnify sound. No matter how softly a speaker spoke, his comrades could hear him from any corner of the vast room, wherein generations of Mundanian rulers had been crowned, wed, and had their very last magic words said over them in the form of the burial rite. Not surprisingly, when 7 boys play games of this kind, it is only a matter of time before one of them attempts to supersede the others in an act he calls clever, and his fellows call cheating. Today, Prince Abel was the cheater. He mouthed his words as if he had spoken them, and claimed that he'd won the challenge when the others couldn't hear him. This led to echoes of arguing beneath the center dome. Then the echoes of shouting, then of grunting and grappling, and soon came the chaos-halting echo of the abbot, who asked the boys to act as if their own personal 11th commandment was, "Keep thy destructive hands to thyself in the house of the Almighty." Abbeys must truly be wonderful places, thought the sons of the sheik. The brick-and-mortar dwellers would not appoint such a strict guardian to a place unless they were trying to cover up a good thing. Later on, the boys got the idea that the god revered in the hilltop abbey of Bordeaux and the god to whom they prayed in their billowy tents were not the same fellow. "But that's him, I swear it's him, the man with the beard and the shiny ball in his hand," said Joe, for the abbot had always said so. "You lie. God's not a man at all," argued the brothers, for their fathers and grandfathers had always said so. "Anyway, didn't you say he was the boy with the glowy face?" "That's him as a baby," said Joe. "That's absurd. God has always been here. How could he ever have been a baby?" After talking it over for a while, each brother began to think that perhaps his brothers might be mistaken about their God as well. "How can you possibly believe he has a body? He is perfection, and bodies aren't perfect," said Abram. "But he made man in his own image, and for your information, dear brothers, man has a body." Amir had thus far been rather quiet during his brother's dispute between the princess and themselves. "What if," he interjected, "we're each thinking about God as though he were a painting, when he's really much more like a sculpture? We would all be seeing something different depending on which angle at which we viewed him, but we'd all be looking at the same thing." This line of thinking caused his brothers to react the way all brothers of a certain age react when questions are posed to which they do not know the answer. Their faces flushed with the heat of passion so powerful it caused them to shout at Amir. They accused him of harboring idolatrous inklings behind his altogether too thoughtful eyes, and challenged him to 5 consecutive death matches, should he survive the first, second, and so on. Rather than answer their challenges directly, Amir dropped one knee so he could look Joe in the eye. "Good princess, may I borrow your snood?" asked Amir. "With or without rocks, my prince?" asked Joe. The dissenting brothers looked at one another, then scattered and hid in the trees of the orchard until well after sundown. "Are they always like that?" asked Joe. "Almost," said Amir. "Father thinks they'll grow out of it. He says they learned it from me." With the rest of the afternoon to themselves, Joe and Amir wandered the castle grounds and scouted out sites for the making of glorious mischief with the rest of the brothers, once the smell of curried goat and garlic bread drew them from the trees and incited a reluctant truce. Amir was particularly impressed by the trapdoors that led from the chapel to the carriage house, and from the corners of the dining hall to various food cellars. There was no place to go once you reached these cellars, but they would make grand hiding places for all the pretend rubies they had mined until such time as the boys could smuggle them out of the country. Small but satisfying adventures with trapdoors and flint-knapping lessons would make the princes and princess look forward to seeing one another from year to year. This pleased their fathers, and gave Sheikh Amir hope for the future in ways he didn't often talk about. Had the sons of Sheikh Amir been the only princes Joe ever met in his life, he would have died thinking they were all darling young men, every one of them a diamond in the proverbial rough, though the roughness-to-diamond ratios varied a bit among the princes. Then, one day, while playing a one-man game of catch on the mezzanine, Joe threw his love-worn calfskin ball into the air and dropped it out of his reach on the far side of the courtyard wall. He peered out over the railing, which was chest-high to himself, and to his surprise he saw a 10-or-so-year-old boy who had scaled the wall and was peering back at him. This strange boy had mud on his face and an intricate system of dark braids on which a golden crown of grapevines stubbornly clung, despite the boy's apparent best efforts to shake it loose. When the stranger's eye met Joe's, each of the boys hid behind his respective edifice. After a few moments, they cautiously raised their heads, each hoping the other had gone, but hid again in haste upon finding the interloper was still there. After a few comical rounds of peekaboo with this strange boy, Joe called out, "If you please, sire, throw me my ball." The muddy boy looked at the ground below and calculated his odds of leaping off the wall in one go without hurting himself. "If you do as I ask, I'll let you in the front gate. I promise they won't throw you in the dungeon," said Joe. "I'll go to the dungeon with a smile on if they feed me there," said the boy. "Bring me my ball and we'll both eat," said Joe. The muddy boy gave his head a quarter turn and fixed a distrustful eye on Joe. But in the end he guessed the boy on the mezzanine might at least lead him to tastier food than he would find in the dungeon, so he hopped down onto the grass and retrieved the ball. Joe sprinted out to the gate and stood on his toes to unlatch the little door that swung separate from the bulk of the great door. He looked about for telltale signs of ruthless invaders. Then he beckoned the boy inside and latched the gate behind them. "You found it! Thank you," said Joe. He reached for the ball, but the muddy boy snatched it away and held it up over their heads. "Nuh-uh, not until I see some food," he said. Joe's hands went to his hips. "I said bring me my ball, then we'll both eat. That was our bargain and the order of it when you agreed to my terms," said Joe, punctuating his sentence with a futile leap for his ball. "But how do I know you'll keep your word?" said the boy. "I'm Mundanian, I always keep my word," said Joe. "Well, I'm a wild woodsman, and I never trust anyone I've only just met," said the boy. "So if you'll be so kind as to give me the food I seek and fetch me an out-of-the-way place where I might hide, I will be overjoyed to give your ball back." Joe stopped straining to reach the heights of the other boy's hands and stared with no less shock and confusion than if the muddy boy had called him names and slapped his face. He had never heard the word of a Mundanian question in his whole 3/4 of a decade of life. Well, what was Joe to do except for prove himself a worthy host to this ball-snatching scoundrel? "All right, then. Find a shady corner up in the hay of the stable loft. I'll be up soon with some sweets," said Joe, and he took leave of the stranger to seek audience with Raoul, the royal confectioner. Raoul was a short, swarthy man of many opinions who had been thrown out of a staggering number of countries for expressing those opinions to whomever he felt like. In Mundania he had found a home and gotten along famously. This was in large part due to the fact that King John never complained about Raoul's candy. It was mouth-watering candy of various aromas and degrees of decadence. No one, especially the children, wanted to tell Raoul that in order to be a real Mundanian confectioner, he would have to make candy less excellently than the way he was currently doing it. As a delicious consequence, Mundanians had to grow accustomed to above-average sweets. It wasn't easy. Not long after Raoul had gone to work for King John, Joe learned that if he asked for sweets between meals, his petition would be rejected outright, either by his mother or one of the Castle Bordeaux's many cooks. However, if he turned up at the eastern cellar door and offered to, quote, help, unquote, Raoul would hastily send Joe away with 2 overflowing handfuls of whatever he was making. Today, the fragrance wafting through the air a little way above Raoul's downstairs kitchen was that of elder-flower cheese tarts. As predicted, the princess offered Raoul the benefit of his humble servitude, and Raoul shooed Joe away in giving him a stack of cheese tarts so high he had to hold the top of the stack with his chin and one hand in the middle to keep it steady. Back at the stable, the 2 boys made a rich, gooey feast of the tarts, then tossed Joe's ball between them while the stranger told his story. It seemed his name was Tamarack, and he was the eldest of 2 children born to King Witchelm and Lady Henbane of the Wild Wood. As Joe listened to the tale the stranger told, his eyes wandered across details of Tamarack's appearance that struck him as unusual for a prince. The shirt that peeked out from under his jerkin had frayed cuffs on each sleeve, where Joe guessed there had once been ties or ruffles, presumably missing because they'd gotten in the prince's way once too often. What looked at a glance like untimely gray hairs were actually fine silver threads, which had been meticulously woven into Tamarack's dark braids, but allowed to grow out and tarnish for lack of upkeep. From the grubby state of the rest of his clothes to the churlishness of his manner when he first arrived, Joe would have taken this fellow to be a starving, world-weary fugitive, though he seemed awfully young for it. As it turned out, he'd only just left home yesterday. "Won't your parents be upset when they find you've gone?" asked Joe. "My parents are always upset," said Tamarack. "Mother's upset with Father for turning into a controlling, gullible tyrant where family is concerned. Father is, well, a controlling, gullible tyrant." "Gullible?" asked Joe. "Superstitious, at least," said Tamarack. "Some soothsayer by the name of Nettle came to the wood a while back and said, 'One of your children is going to die, and I'm not going to tell you which one.' Since then, Father's gone quite peculiar, deciding everything on behalf of the family and demanding to know where we are at all times. So when we've had our fill of it, we run away. Then Father tracks us down and tightens his grasp some more, and we run a bit further the next time. This is the furthest I've been from home so far." "Why did you run this way?" asked Joe. "Wouldn't the tribal territories or the foothills of neither folk be closer?" "Not safer," said Tamarack. "The territories have never been overly friendly with outsiders and have turned downright hostile since the drought. Besides which, I may have killed my sister." "What?" said Joe, forgetting how to play catch so completely in light of this news that he dropped his ball to the floor. Tamarack picked up the ball and passed it between his hands nervously as he continued. "Well, we'd worked out that we could travel faster on horseback, and one missing horse might be noticed less quickly than two. But we'd only made it as far as the Octavian Way before the tribesmen shot arrows at us from above. Warning shots, I guess. But the horse got spooked. I managed to hold on when she reared and took off at a gallop, but Bittersweet, that's my sister, got thrown to the ground." "And you didn't go back?" asked Joe. "It all happened so fast, and I was so afraid. I got as far as the plains on horseback, then set off on foot. I figured if they found a horse and no rider, they might think we were both lost and be less likely to come looking for us." "That's hard luck for your Bittersweet all the same," said Joe. He looked away and added, "Poor dear." "She's not that poor. She did choose to ride with me," said Tamarack. "Not her. I mean, yes, her, but I was thinking about the soothsayer. It all just now sunk in. What kind of horrible parents name their child Nettle?" asked Joe, whose whole body bristled in remembrance of red, painful legs on summer days after running through a broadleaf botanical of the same name. "A foresighted family who knew their boy was going to grow up to be irritating," suggested Tamarack. Not terribly long after that, King John and Queen Jane were summoned to the front gate to greet some unexpected visitors who sought their aid. "I'm not here," said Tamarack, in a hoarse whisper while attempting to bury himself in a pile of hay on which he sat. Joe peeked out the loft's little window and saw just beyond the gate an austere man wearing a green tunic and an enormous crown of entwined antlers. At his side stood a lovely but equally austere lady with a round chin and a flowing dress with huge bell sleeves. Directly in front of her stood a very little girl in a simple dress caked with mud. Her hair was caught up in a sheer cloth and a silk ribbon, also mud-stained, that hung down her back and bulged wherever the ribbon crossed. This led Joe to believe the girl might have hair as voluminous as his own, and made him wonder what secret sorcery her mother or she had used to tame it. King John and his queen talked with the strangers a while about the whereabouts of a missing child. When they looked around and did not see their own child, Queen Jane sent servants in several directions in order to collect him. His nanny, helpful thing that she was, headed straight for the stables, for she knew well the hayloft was one of Joe's favorite hiding places. "Look, you can't stay here forever. You might as well go out and turn yourself in," said Joe. "Turn yourself in? I'm quite happy here," said the tamarack-shaped lump of hay. "Come out this instant, or I'll tell them you took me hostage," said Joe. "You wouldn't either," said Tamarack, popping his head out from under the hay. "The word liar does not suit a princess." "Nor coward a prince," said Joe. That did it. Tamarack stood straight up, brushed the chaff from his jacket, and marched out to greet his parents. Joe followed a few steps behind for moral support. When King Witchelm and his son saw one another, their eyes locked, and such was the look of tempered fear and rage between them, Joe felt its heat from as much as 4 paces back. "Disappointed as I am that both of you have disobeyed me, I am disgusted above all that any son of mine would leave his sister for dead in the middle of a mountain pass." "We didn't actually get that far," said Tamarack. King Witchelm took a deep breath and held his hands behind his back so his son would not see them shake. "Nevertheless, since you have wronged the Lady Bittersweet far greater than you have wronged me, I have chosen to let her decide your punishment." Tamarack stood stone still. Lady Bittersweet drew near to her brother in graceful, gliding strides of which Joe found himself a trifle envious. She looked her brother straight in the eye for a moment, then dealt him a swift blow to the nose with the heel of her hand. Tamarack's shoulders crumpled inward. He cupped both hands loosely around his throbbing nose as Bittersweet glided back to her mother. Joe leapt forward. With one hand he steadied Tamarack's shoulder, and with the other he offered a kerchief for the catching of tears, blood, or both. "Are you all right?" asked Joe. "What do you think?" asked Tamarack, having lost his M's and N's to the start of a massive swollen bruise between his eyes. Joe folded his arms. He straightened all the way up and tried for the first and possibly only time in his life to look like an older man. "Well, you've used up your allotted thimbleful of pity, young sire," he said. "It's a lucky thing for you she's tiny-sized, not yours or mine, or she might have broken that nose." "Dodo, trust me," said Tamarack. "If she wanted her tiny hands to break my nose, they would have. Farewell, princess. It was dice while it lasted. The prince joined his people outside the gates of Bordeaux. Just before the gates blocked the royal families from view of one another, Tamarack shot Joe a sly glance and lifted the kerchief about his nose to show that underneath it he still had Joe's ball. What a stinker, was Joe's first thought. His next thought was, Lady Henbane didn't say anything. She just stood there and let her daughter punch her son in the face. Joe ran to his own mother and hugged her about her knees the way he imagined Prince Tamarack may never have been permitted to do with Lady Henbane. Queen Jane ran her fingers through her son's hair and gave the back of his neck a gentle squeeze. "Please don't make me marry a prince like that," said Joe. "I don't expect to, my love," said the Queen. "But on the bright side, every time we meet one of the bad ones, it helps us appreciate the good ones a lot more." With this in mind, Joe returned to the diggings where the desert princes and he had spent a goodly amount of their last visit in excavation, and spent the remaining wakeful hours of his day in search of the very best ruby for Prince Amir. Sheikh Amir, whose caravan generally passed through Mundania twice a year en route to and from the seaside, had an olive complexion, and the compact form of a middle-aged man who rarely went hungry. He was also a brilliant, careful man who seldom made friends. Therefore, he prized his friendship with King John, who had never shown himself to be anything but a loyal, honest companion. Kings from elsewhere on the continent tended to ignore Sheikh Amir practically all of the time. The rest of the time they were insulting him. "Vagabonds and thieves, that shady sheik and his cronies," these kings would whisper among themselves with their eyes narrowed and their noses upturned. "Why else would those desert rats need to move around so much? They're no doubt trying to outrun the bill collectors." In the eyes of many a castled king, Sheikh Amir's failure to accrue a house with brick-and-mortar walls was a telltale sign that he was a lesser leader than themselves and not to be taken seriously. And he dressed funny. He never bothered to correct the assumptions of his less-than-enlightened peers, but for most of his life, Sheikh Amir was the richest man in the known world. Prior to inheriting the title of Sheikh, Gabriel Amir III was one in a set of triplets among whom his father had the unenviable task of choosing an heir. The choice was far from simple. All three children were healthy, strong, and fair of face. All three were on their best behavior if ever they suspected their father was watching them. This former sheik found himself at such a loss regarding which child would best succeed him that he turned to his reluctant ally, the Green Genie, for help. The Green Genie was a solitary spirit who had not been greatly impressed with mortals in years past, but having no desire to see his marvelous desert governed by idiots, he agreed to give the children a test of wisdom by offering each child one wish. While his brother and sister wished for bottomless mineral mines and tireless silkworms, Gabriel Amir III wished more than anything to spend the rest of his life helping things grow. From the moment his wish was uttered and granted, fig trees flourished, and jasmine blossoms bloomed on their vines whenever he was near. Unlivable lands of dust and whirlwind became fertile grassland. So great was his rapport with green and growing things that tangles of thorny underbrush made way for him wherever he walked, and tree roots buried themselves deep in the earth so they would not trip him. Even his brother and sister, with whom he had hitherto endured a heated rivalry, now lived with him in harmony because he was helping them grow as well. The current Sheikh Amir never regretted the wish he made all those years ago the way those who meet the Green Genie sometimes do. Just the same, his tribe and he never spoke about the source of their prosperity to outsiders, choosing instead to let would-be conquerors esteem them penniless drifters and hardly worth the conquering. King John and Queen Jane, of course, knew of the sheik's unique kinship with growing things. Mundania as a whole did not. By the time Princess Jo came along, the smell of warming spice and the biannual appearance of the nomads' burgundy tents with their brass finials in King John's orchard were both status and quo, as was the thriving of the crops at those times of year. So old was this tradition that younger citizens of Bordeaux thought it was ordinary to have fat, ripe pumpkins in June and trees heavy laden with cherry blossoms in September. Elderly citizens who remembered a time when things were different generally shrugged and chalked it all up to climate change. In return for the steadfast trust of King John and his queen, Sheikh Amir made a point of visiting them whenever he happened to be in the neighborhood and keeping them up to date on the latest happenings in the nations around them. At the moment, the craze taking their continent by storm was reading. For the first time in their lives, persons in high places were expected to know how to read and write. King John paced up and down the mezzanine, and his jaw muscles tightened at the thought of once again enduring another uncomfortable embrace with change. His eyebrows drew so close at the bridge of his nose that the sheik believed they could have cracked a walnut between them if they placed it at the centermost furrows of his friend's brow. "If not a walnut, perhaps a small almond. I happen to have some if you'd like to try it," said the sheik. "No, thank you," said the king. Sheik Amir strolled on a parallel path to King John in unhurried strides. As he did so, he ran his hands along the balcony's alabaster railing. This caused full-faced morning glories in the gardens below to awaken long past their bedtimes and race one another en route to meet him. So great was King John's worry that he took no notice of these overachieving morning glories. "This reading and writing of which you speak so highly cannot be without its dangers," said the king. "What if we grow so accustomed to writing things down that we no longer remember them, and there's a great fire? The writings will be burned, and the knowledge will be lost forever. On the other hand, what if there's a plague? The keepers of the knowledge will die, and the knowledge will be lost just the same," countered the sheik. King John came by his trepidation honestly. Up to that point in history, Mundanian monarchs had all enjoyed the oral traditions of their ancestors. They had phenomenal memories, and not only could they tell you what the law said word for word, they could tell you which king said it, on what day, and at what time of day. But persons who could read and write were growing steadily more shrewd and brazen. Laws were suddenly being passed behind closed doors without a single spoken word. Out of concern that the Mundanian bureaucrats may soon be tempted to play tricks on their illiterate king, Sheik Amir strongly suggested both King John and his princess learn how to read and write. "Can we do that?" asked King John in a hushed voice, as if his friend and he were plotting to commit the dirtiest of deeds. "My people are just now getting used to having a boy for a princess. An intellectual princess is just as unheard of." "Well, sire," said Sheik Amir, "if educating your child is the most controversial thing you do in your kingly reign, you will have done it wrong." Such was the introduction of formal education to Princess Jo and his family. That summer, when their desert friends departed, King John borrowed a tutor from the sheik's employ, with whom the princess and he spent the next year learning how to read. And they hated it. Both father and son had been well aware for some time that cows say moo and cats say meow and dragons say whatever they want. Painstakingly having to read about it did not excite them. About 6 months into their lessons, the king and his boy found that they could read for pleasure. Their studies progressed less tediously after that, because the more they learned, the more interesting their books became. King John was spellbound by the written word once he knew enough to figure out how things worked. His eyes were alight with intent and passion whenever he could look at a diagram or an architectural drawing and understand what it said. Joe's reading tastes differed greatly from his father's, especially early on. He liked the classics, and he thought epic poetry was the best thing he'd ever heard of. It was absolutely brimming with adventure, suspense, and monsters, and as all little boys know, the gruesomer the monster, the better the story. Some of his favorites included the three-eyed giant of New Parnassus, the child-snatching water hag of the Frequent Sea, and the cannibalistic whiskered waifs of Mount Phobos. Between books, Queen Jane introduced her child to the art of needlepoint, as Jane's mother had done for her when she was a princess. Thanks to Lady Ambrosia's extraordinary gifts, Joe was so very good at embroidering that he outsewed the queen and cross-stitched impish things on his sewing projects out of sheer boredom. Such proficiency at embroidering and other tasks befitting the conventions of princesshood satisfied his mother, and Joe returned to his paper and ink monster hunts. Joe's reading tastes began to change when he discovered a book of folk tales entitled Father Phineas's Folly. It was one of the abbot's favorite books. So great was the abbot's affection for this book, in fact, that when the church tried to burn it along with a number of its sacrilegious bookshelf companions, he donated it to King John's library and was known to visit it after full moons and high holy days. In Father Phineas's Folly, Joe found a story much like the one his nanny once told him. Except in the Father Phineas version, the prince was the hero, not a fiendish foe from whom the girl felt she had to run and hide. And her fairy godmother was so helpful. She appeared to the girl in times of trouble, and all her spells did something to make the girl's life simpler, not harder. Joe read the book twice with his chin on his fists and a dour gaze fixed on the pages before him. Not all the stories had a prince or princess in them. Some had devils and goblins and whatnot, but without fail, whenever the prince showed up in a story, he rewarded the well-behaved princess with marriage to himself. The quintessential princess story, on the other hand, seemed to begin at a castle, end at a castle, and require her, and it was always her, to sleep through anything that might have been brave or worthwhile. Dear me, is that the best I can hope for in life? To be the drowsy, flaxen-haired ornament on the arm of some self-important prince? Asked Joe of the abbot. And what about Lady Ambrosia? I realize she doesn't owe me anything, and if I get into some dreadful scrape or other, she's not required to help me out of it, but could we even picture her trying? I happen to know Lady Ambrosia is always trying, said the abbot, whose opinion of fairies had not softened much over the years. Your trouble is you want to hold your godmother responsible for a bunch of pretty lies told by Father Phineas for the purpose of entertaining and instructing peasants. That's not entirely fair. Why not? If the instruction is good enough for a peasant, shouldn't it be good enough for a princess and a fairy godmother? Asked Joe. No, indeed, said the abbot, gesturing with the book of contention in his hand. Fond as I am of these old stories, they'd have you believing your godmother is the keeper of wishing trees, and that any time you want something you can simply ask her to shake a ripe one loose for you. That's not what they're for. Wishing trees or fairy godmothers? Either, said the abbot. He let the book land with a thud as he set it in front of Joe. And I'm glad you're a smart young fellow, but if you get too much smarter, I won't be able to answer your questions, and you'll be stuck trying to figure things out for yourself. Would you like me to stop? Asked Joe. I don't much want to, but I'll do it for you. Not now, said the abbot with a sigh. When you're old and learning becomes more work than fun, then you can try your hand at boredom. Until then, you won't appreciate it one bit. The princess put the writings of Father Phineas aside, and for some months he turned to natural philosophy for his pleasure reads. Their words were logical, if sometimes on the dry side, and it took up less space in Joe's head than did certain fictional books. Of course, Joe was not the only one with difficult questions on his mind. Shortly after the abbot left off speaking with the princess, King John invited the holy man to the northern cellar where the best of the port wine was kept, for a stiff drink and a quick word. Tell me the truth, Ben, said the king to the holy man. If my son the princess marries a prince at some point in the coming years, will he be welcome at the abbey? In times past, the order has not been friendly to boys who marry boys and girls who marry girls. It's true, they haven't, said the abbot. He swirled his wine in his goblet and breathed in its warm, tart scent for some time before giving the king an answer. The archbishop would excommunicate me if he heard what I am about to tell you, but what I usually tell parents with similar concerns is this. The holy books, on which the order is supposed to base its rules, takes a dim view on men who don't end up with women and women who don't end up with men, but they also paint a clear picture of what love is and is not. Love is patient, is not proud, does not boast. If ever your boy should ask this question and I am not here to answer it, tell him to take the name of whomever his heart desires and replace love in those old scriptures with whatever the person's name is. If at any point the words the scriptures use to describe love do not describe Annabel or Percival or whoever, that is not the person he should marry. But they still might not be accepted by the church? Asked the king. 2 or more people gathered in the name of God is a church, said the abbot. This cellar contains far too much wine. Help me fix it, said the king, who topped off his own drinking vessel and that of his friend. Do I offend? Said the abbot. No, you don't offend. You bewilder that there aren't a dozen more like you at the abbey. I can't think of too many other holy men who would go out of their way to make my child's scandalous birthright sound like it makes good common sense, said the king. The abbot shrugged. I have spent enough time in the world, and with your son, to believe with my whole heart that Joe is all right. It's the world that does not make sense. At 12 years old, Joe's tutor taught him a word that gave all other words new significance. Etymology. Etymology meant that most of the words which Joe spoke, wrote, and thought, believing them to be the Mundanian language, used to be other words from other languages. He began to look words up for fun, and pleasantly surprised his tutor with the speed at which he could memorize phrases in Petulan and Belligerent, 2 fairly dormant tongues from which various nations had borrowed a whole lot of words. It is perhaps worth mentioning that though King John and Princess Jo both became quite the amateur scholars in their bookish pursuits, Queen Jane never learned to read or write. The unfairness of this would not occur to the princess until he was much older, but his mother never took the oversight personally. It simply hadn't occurred to the king and princess to include the queen in their lessons, or for Queen Jane to include herself. Once and only once did Jo mistake his newfound literacy for wisdom. For many preceding months, Queen Jane had tried, and for the most part succeeded, to teach her son the nuances of courtly etiquette. His poise, his active listening skills, and his deference to non-mother or father authority figures seemed to come naturally in social settings. But Jo was getting dangerously close to his teen years, which meant his natural charm was walking hand in hand with some equally natural testing of boundaries. That particular day, Jo was engrossed in Magnuson the Lesser's philosophy on poisonous plants. The Queen had asked the same question of him 3 times, while Jo ignored her 3 times and continued to read. When she asked him to put his book down, he recited the belligerent phrase for "Be still, old one," with great conviction and his best attempt at a belligerent accent. "Gad, am I clever," he thought, as 12-year-olds sometimes do. "Mother will have no way to understand me. The best she can do is sharply glance in my direction and say, 'What was that?' I will of course say nothing, and we shall both go about our day." Things did not go the way Princess Jo had anticipated. Not only did Queen Jane answer him in belligerent, she corrected his pronunciation and informed him she would not speak to him until he learned how to say "I'm sorry," both in belligerent and in Underbarian, Queen Jane's first language. So he did, and he wished his mother had instead sent him to bed without supper that week. The odious Underbarian language is thought to have developed as a result of Underbaria having been governed by a ruthless chieftain with a stutter once upon a time. It was such a horrid language that when the Overbarians invaded, their first order of business was to outlaw its use. It had only one vowel sound, which was that of a short U, and twice as many consonants as the alphabet Jo had learned. In some cases, the transposition between languages was fairly straightforward, like Grandfather Augustus might be Augustus. In most cases, the Underbarian tongue seemed to wag itself in happy ignorance of what syllables its letters ought to sound like when next to one another, as was the case with the Underbarian equivalent of Jane, which is spelled M-V-U-Y-N. The Queen eventually took pity on her son, in that she downgraded his murder of her native language to accidental slaughter, and forgave him for his less than princess-like behavior. Jo forgave himself a bit later.